I'm Mina Malik Hussain, and you're watching The Coffee Table, and today is my favorite kind of show because we're going to be talking about books. Take a moment to sort of bask in the happiness of that. Today we're going to be talking not just about books in general, of course, we're going to be talking about nonfiction and narrative nonfiction, which is the real sort of underdog of the Pakistani literary world, but there are wonderful things and wonderful opportunities to be had in the genre. So joining me today is Sanam Maher, who is a Karachi-based journalist and author. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, and Al Jazeera, BuzzFeed, The Caravan, The Times Literary Supplement, and best of all, she is the author of the fantastic book, A Woman Like Her, The Short Life of Qandeel Baloch, which was published in South Asia in 2018, in the UK, Australia, and Europe in 2019, in the US and Canada in 2020, and was listed as one of the New York Times' top books of 2020, which means basically it's been published all around the world, and everybody loves it. And joining me on set, which is always super exciting, is Madeeha Maqbool, who is the coolest civil servant you'll ever meet. She is a Commonwealth scholar and a book reviewer with bylines in the News, Libas International, and the Friday Times, amongst others. She is also the brains behind the popular bookstagram Maddie's Library and has interviewed Eugene Rogan for the Lahore Literary Festival and Peter Frankopan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Mina.
This is wonderful. I'm very excited. Hi, Sanam. Welcome to the show from, across the internet.
Yeah, I wish I was sitting in the studio with you guys.
I know.
It would be so much nicer than this Zoom interaction.
I know, it's true. But oddly enough, having people Zoom in has kind of expanded our horizons also. So it's a sort of, you win some, you lose some.
That's true.
So Sanam, tell me, you are a journalist and now you've written a nonfiction book, and not just any book, but a very excellent one. So do you feel like your background in one kind of writing really helped you write a different kind of thing?
I do. I think with this book, it started out as me being very interested in what was the story of this woman who all of us were watching while she was alive, but none of us actually seemed to know very much about her and about her life and who she was, where she came from. So it started out as kind of a journalistic venture, but then, I'm a reader, I'm a big reader. I think the biggest thing, whether you're doing fiction or nonfiction, is how do you tell a story really well? How do you keep someone engaged? How do you get someone who's a reader here in Pakistan to pick up a nonfiction book, particularly about a subject that's not the happiest subject, where we all knew the ending. It was a terrible ending. So how do you tell that story really, really well? And it wasn't just things I was reading, but everything I could watch, everything, so sort of TV, films, books, like how do I bring all those ways of telling a story in to tell this in the most compelling way possible?
And I think it's really important that you've talked about how do you tell a story, because when we think about nonfiction, I feel like generally the idea is that nonfiction is really boring and it's factual and it's it should be about, like, even if it's about history or it's about politics or it's a memoir, then it's just a kind of almost textbook-like narration of, in this year, this happened, then this happened. So I feel like the idea is always that, well, nonfiction, snooze. And then here you are telling us that you're telling a story. And okay, how does that work? What is that alchemy?
I think we've been seeing, we don't read, this is just a sense I have, this isn't based on any facts, but from what I can see and just from like what you see in the shops here as well, we tend to be bigger fiction readers, and the nonfiction that we see is mostly written by ambassadors, politicians, people who are experts in, say, like a business field or entrepreneurs or something like that. And we're very used to reading that kind of nonfiction if we have to. It's almost zabardasti. I couldn't remember seeing anything which was for someone my age or like a young woman my age who wants to just read about what exactly are we doing, how are we living, how are we sort of absorbing this culture around us, what are the things we care about. And this story we cared very deeply about, what happened to this young woman. So what is a way that I can tell this story in, we see nonfiction from all around the world playing with the genre, doing different things. And this was a really great opportunity to sort of run with it and do whatever I liked with the story.
No, I think that's really fun. Madeeha, you read so much nonfiction. You're the champion. I think you are the only person I know who reads this much nonfiction. And I mean it in a very complimentary way. Not in the boring, the boring taste. But again, I'm sort of coming back to this idea that we see nonfiction in a certain way. Like it's not fun. And it's not it's not engaging. And which is why I think that Sanam is right, that it's a kind of duality of boringness, where the nonfiction that we have in the market is often genuinely boring things. Like, I don't want to know about an entrepreneur's life journey and, how did I do my business?
Yeah, and I think, for example, when I was in school, there isn't any encouragement for reading history, for example, because the general sense is, oh my God, I can't remember dates. And, that's something that you just keep running with, even though you might actually be very good at remembering dates. This is something I discovered really late. And then even with books on history, on non-fiction that are in the market, they're really boringly presented.
Yes.
The covers are really boring. For example, most of the books that are being published now are academic. They're being published by Oxford University Press, and nobody looks at them.
No,
they're in this very tiny section. They're not in front of the bookstore at all. They're not being marketed. On the other hand, if you look at books published, for example, in the UK or the US, and you see that they're really beautifully printed and the blurbs are really amazing.
Yeah.
Like they'll appear on Instagram, in the New York Times, in other places as well, where they're actually telling you and, like drawing you in by giving you a very interesting backstory. Get, this is what it's about.
Yeah.
And that's something that's drawn me in. That's why I started reading it. And it's something that affects other people as well. But when it comes to, our indigenous books being written by Pakistanis, they're mostly academic books. And like Sanam said, they're mostly being written by ambassadors or, civil servants, army officers.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't even remember who it was, but I've read like Crossed Swords and, like so many other books which people buy. They're really fat and they display them on their shelves and then forget about them.
Yeah.
So that's what happens. And it's, I think it's a publishing thing as well in Pakistan.
Yeah,
and it's something that's a cultural thing maybe, where people are not being encouraged to read it. There aren't, like you don't have friends telling you, oh my God, this is interesting, you should read it. I do that with my friends. I'm sure they're sick of me by now.
No.
But
Many
generally,
people believe you.
Yeah, hopefully, yes. Hopefully, yes.
Yeah. But do you think, and Sanam, because you've sold a lot of books, so do you think that this is not a problem of readership, but it's a problem of availability? So it's just that people would read it if it were there.
I agree, absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest things that I learned with this book, that publishers are also a little bit hesitant to take on stories from this part of the world. And when I say, let's just look at South Asia, for instance. Just our lives here, everyday lives, what the average person is thinking, doing, feeling, how they want to live. If we look at true crime as a genre, which this book falls into, I think it's such an incredible opportunity to explore something that's happened that reveals a lot about the place or the culture or how people are thinking. But publishers are also a little bit wary because they're not sure if there's going to be an audience for those kinds of books. And sometimes that's really informed, and we're really, really dependent on their marketing and sales teams. And their marketing and sales teams tend to be conservative and to say, oh, is an American reader really going to be interested in this? Is a British, like a young British woman, what does she want to read about? But now what we're really seeing is ideas of representation or diversity, or trying to expand who is this average reader that you're considering when you say, oh, will a book sell or not? And that's hugely expanding now, but it's slow. And I think we have a lot of work still to do in this area, considering who a reader is and what they want to read. But the more books that will come out, the more we'll learn about what does well, and they'll put more money behind more of those stories.
Absolutely. That kind of leads me to my next issue of wonderment, is that clearly we have a lot of stories to tell, and we have stories that aren't necessarily the same old tired rhetoric about, this part of the world, right? It's not always about the underdog championing, and it's not always about, struggling through your adversity or terrible things happening, but genuinely compelling and interesting stories about people and about, the way that they live, like you said. So why aren't we writing more of it?
I think we are, I mean, I get a lot of questions. If I even just look at my Instagram, so many young people will reach out to me over there and message me about, I want to break into the market. I want to write something. They're not necessarily sure how to even go about it. I mean, when I started, it was purely by fluke that I was approached because of the journalism that I was doing. So I was approached by editors, publishing houses. But if I had to just set out on my own and say, oh, I want to work on this book, we don't necessarily have a network here of authors that are maybe talking about how you break into this market. We don't talk about it at our Lit Fest. I mean, we have 3 major literature festivals in this country. We don't necessarily have that culture of even, going to book events at bookshops or have independent bookshops that run these sorts of things where you get to interact with authors and you get to ask them these sorts of things. So I think young people, they have the stories, they really have the talent. And something that really confirmed this for me is I'm part of this mentorship program that's actually started up this year for young South Asian writers. And we received 500 applications just in a short amount of time that we said, send in your applications, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, translations. And the kinds of ideas that were coming across there, it was amazing, and it's amazing to see. And so I hope things like these start to pick up, like programs like these, where then you get to interact with authors or other writers and you just learn how to do it. As long as you can tell a story well, you just need a little help figuring out the industry or the marketplace. And that's the first step, really.
But on your Instagram also, do people reach out to ask you questions like that? Because you're not a writer, but you're clearly somebody who's, very much inhabits the world of writing.
People ask me a lot about reading, about books, etc. Not necessarily about writing, but they do ask me about, like which books should I read, where they're available. The biggest problem in Pakistan where, as soon as you want a book, it's out of stock or it's never, even appeared in Pakistan. So that's something that happens. But as far as writing is concerned, like you're on Instagram, right? And I'm sure we all follow thousands of people at this point. And you see so many people writing a lot on Instagram. Like they're really long captions, maybe, like blogs. It's sort of a micro-blogging platform at this point. So there are people writing a lot about their lives, about, their experiences in various fields, work-related, fashion, etc. But it's something that I was discussing the other day as well. It's like, but there's no culture of writing, for example, personal essays. It's something that's very popular, in other countries as well, in other publishing arenas. But it's something that hasn't taken off in Pakistan, despite people actually writing sort of, personal essays on Instagram or maybe on, like other platforms like this. And I think it's sort of a lack of encouragement or, this general sense that, oh my God, who's going to be interested if you write formally? So that's something that comes in as well. And as far as history, etc. goes, I remember with this other writer, Aanchal Malhotra, that she started writing about material memory and, like oral history, etc.
related, all of that.
Exactly. And I think that's influenced people to, for example, dig out stories from their grandparents, from, like old things from their own house, writing about them. So you see elements of that, but they're not doing it coherently. Like not to actually get published somewhere. And that's something, and I think there's a dearth of magazines as well. Because, like, for example, I'm sure you might have submitted as well. In the UK, there's Granta. And, like, exactly. And there's so many. I'm sure it's going to get published. And, there's so many platforms like that. But in Pakistan, there just isn't. Honestly speaking, like there's the Aleph Review now, and like maybe the Sag Anthology.
They're collective. It's sort of picking up. We're going to take a very quick break here because I want to dissect this even further. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. We're having a riveting conversation about non-fiction writing with book reviewer and Instagrammer Madeeha Maqbool and journalist and author Sanam Maher. So before the break, Madeeha, we were talking about how a lot of people are writing kind of like micro non-fiction on social media. And this has been happening for a long time, like, back in the day, because, I'm an older person. People used to blog a lot.
I had one as well,
yes, of course, I'd shake your hand from across the table. We all did. And a lot of that was a personal essay. I think
Yeah.
that's how one would describe the bulk of it. Like I don't think a lot of people are writing fiction on a blog.
No, they weren't.
Or on Instagram, people they'll have poetry up, for example, but the caption that you were talking about, the caption is all really personal essays. So on the one hand, we have an aptitude for it, and there are people who are writing it, and some people are doing a really good job of it also. But then there is a kind of nervousness about taking it one step further. But do you think that this is also like a cultural problem?
It is a cultural problem, and it's not even a readership problem, because like you would imagine that people are just, for example, these influencers, some of them have really long captions. So you would think that most of their audience are only looking at their pictures. That's not the case. People actually go through really long captions, comment on them. So people are reading. But it is a lack of encouragement as well. And I think it feeds into our entire culture, I think, as a nation. Because when you're at school, you're at university, it is very rare to actually find a mentor or someone, even as a teacher, anyone who will tell you that, yes, you should pursue this or you should write. Most of the people are telling you, oh my God, who's going to listen to you? Who's going to read what you're writing? So people, like, they might go into mainstream journalism because then people have to read them. Obviously, you're being published in a newspaper or a magazine or something.
And then you get paid also, which is also nice.
Exactly. But the thing is, like, we don't even have magazines like the Aleph Review, etc. are new, but previously as well there wasn't a platform, and obviously it's a huge leap of imagination to imagine that you'd get published in the New Yorker or Granta or the Paris Review, etc. So most people don't even submit. It's something that they're like, oh yeah, when we have a significant body of work, maybe somebody will be interested and we'll submit then. But right now, and when you're starting out, like there isn't a place where people feel that they might, be able to submit something or actually write a sustained amount of, like a proper personal essay with a lot of social maybe commentary, looking beyond your own personality or, just your own experience.
Yeah, and sort of using an anecdotal experience, but then sort of taking your essay
Exactly, and I think that's something that Sanam has done as well. Like taken a story and, shown something that's going on within our society as well.
Exactly.
So and that's actually what makes it interesting.
Yeah, lots of things interesting. Yeah, indeed. But Sanam, do you also feel that, I'm glad that Madeeha brought up school, for example, and that there are a lot of people who are promising writers, and then sort of a lot of people write and stick things in a drawer and then go and do a 9-to-5 job, and a lot of people then become journalists because they want to write, but everyone is just like, well, that's writing. Fiction is not a lucrative thing. So I think I'm asking you two things. One is this, then I'm going to ask you the second thing. It's basically about encouragement. Like, do you feel like when we think of writing, and we think of creative writing, we only think of fiction?
That's really true. I think that tends to be, if you say I'm an author, people tend to think, oh, fiction. Even with this book, actually, you'd be surprised the number of times I get asked, so how much of this did you make up? Or how much of this is fiction? And I'm like, I'm not actually allowed to do that. If it's non-fiction and if it's a reported thing, I wish it would make my life a lot easier and my job a lot easier if I could just make things up and add them in. But when we're talking about things like social media or Instagram, I have to say, like, I disagree a little bit that I feel things are changing a lot more. It has become, like, it's such a democratic space. If you want to be a writer, if you just want to test the waters and you want to put stuff out on Instagram and you are smart enough where you know how to use that format to tell a story well, that's not an easy thing. To use that small amount of space, to have the image, to have the visuals, to tell your story there. There's so many writers I've discovered just on Instagram and young people, particularly young women, where I'm amazed by how they'll even use Instagram stories and tell a story so well. So I feel like these kind of legacy publications, like aiming for the New Yorker, the Paris Review, or whatever it is, I think we've seen enough now, and not that I'm just salty because I haven't been accepted there, but we've seen enough of publishing now to know it's really important to consider who are the people who are in decision-making positions at these places. What are the kinds of works that they're going to put their money and their time behind? And if they're not accepting you, it doesn't mean whatever you submitted doesn't have merit or that you can't ever even aspire to those spaces. I think we're really changing the way we approach this, where we're saying, well, we'll just make our own spaces. And social media is kind of the most easy, free, open way to do that. And the most lo-fi. You don't even have to consider costs or this or that, or having a website. So I love that we're able to write on those spaces.
Yes. But sort of coming back to the writing of nonfiction, and I'm glad that you brought it up. You always feel like, the sort of good organic vibes coming from conversations like these, is that people, like, how does one do it, for example? Now, I feel like a woman like her is that kind of book where, and this is why I think nonfiction is such an exciting space, is because it's really evolved. Like, the scene has completely changed from sort of, boring history narrative, the rise and fall of the Roman empires, whatever stews, to something like this, which is funny and engaging, and it, the storytelling is so absorbing, and it really does feel like a narrative that really pulls you in, and it's not just kind of like, oh, well, this happened and this girl was born here and her name was Fawzia, but then it wasn't. So what excites you about writing nonfiction these days? Like, tell us more about what's out there.
I mean, if I just consider in terms of Pakistan, I really, really want to know what it is that young people are doing, thinking. We're a very young nation, not just in terms of how long we've been around, but the actual sort of number of us that are below the age of 30, the ways in which we're engaging with each other, the ways that in which we sort of create these spaces online where we live out our lives, or we're able to sort of talk to each other. What are we doing in those spaces? I'm really curious about that. And I want to know more about that. I want to know how we're thinking of ourselves as Pakistanis. What do we think of when we say, okay, what is a Pakistani identity? What do young people care about or want to do or aspire to do? How do they take in what's going on in the world, with everything from the Me Too movement to, I mean, you look at just every arena, and that's what I think we need to see more of. Not just stories of, like you said, someone sort of struggling through adversity and making it, or these are the narratives that tend to come out a lot more. I think we're done with those. We're moving on from that.
I love that. I think we really should, and why not? And I feel it's really interesting that nonfiction is the space where we can harness these stories and do it in a kind of, like, I don't know if it's sort of fair to say in an honest way, but let's say outside the cloak of narrative, where you could say, like, well, I'm removed from this. Like, I feel like there's an immediacy with nonfiction that is really appealing to the reader.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad that, like, people are encouraging. For example, last year, the Zenith Harun Rashid Prize was only for nonfiction.
Yeah.
So that encouraged people a lot, because generally, if it's, just a mixed vote, most people submit fiction. The winners are mostly, fiction writers. So this time, and, that encourages people to actually experiment, for example, with the essay form. Yeah. And I love reading that, because, like, they announced the winner, they posted her work on the internet, and the shortlisted people as well. So that was very interesting to read.
It's
and
really
obviously,
exciting.
and they gave a theme as well. About like being a woman in Pakistan. So that's, I think that encouraged people to think about that topic differently as well. And writing for nonfiction essays. So that was really amazing as well.
So what do you think, Sanam?
I think something that we also need to acknowledge while we're talking about reasons for people not writing or why it's not taking off here is it's kind of this dirty little secret with writing or with authors, that you have to have the means to do something like this.
Yes.
Nobody, unless you're like J.K. Rowling or someone very famous and you're being paid for your memoirs or something like that, you're not getting those giant six-figure advances or anything. And there are a lot of young people particularly, they may not know how to break into the market, but also they have to consider their careers over here. They have to consider, how are you actually keeping a house running? And for a lot of people, you come from a place of privilege if you're able to put that time aside for this kind of creative pursuit and sit and just do it. It takes time, it takes effort.
Yes.
A lot of people are just struggling to get through their jobs in the first place.
Quite
and
right.
To sort of think, oh no, but you should be writing a book on the side. It's not easy at all. And we don't often talk about the wealth that is a prerequisite often for going ahead and doing things like this. And I think that also closes off the market to a huge number of writers here. We don't hear about their experiences or their stories because they don't have the means to set that time aside for that effort. let alone break into the market or have writing classes or go to book events or things. I think we should acknowledge that.
No, I think that that's really, really important. And do you think that this is maybe also why it might be on some levels to write fiction instead of nonfiction? Because fiction, if it's just sort of coming from your imagination, and of course there is research that goes into the writing of fiction as well, but not the same kind that I imagine goes into writing nonfiction. Like, for example, what was the kind of research that you had to do to write A Woman Like Her?
I mean, I don't want to compare either of them and say a fiction writer or non-fiction writer. Like it's apples and oranges, really. Like the key thing at the heart of it is telling a good story. But the tools that you use, I mean, what a fiction writer does, I have no idea. It is a very specific skill set. With this, like when you're talking about what goes into it, if you are a reporter, that is a prerequisite here to doing nonfiction. You're either an expert in your field, you're a great researcher, or you're a journalist. With this, for instance, it was 1 year, it was about 200 something interviews. But I had that skill set already. And then I just kind of applied it here. And this is essentially a very, very, very long form piece. That's how I approached it.
Yes. No, but I think that's tremendous. And sort of even the fact of, let's say, the 200 interviews or access to newspaper archives, and this is something that Madeeha, you and I have spoken about before also, is that when we're looking at research, and now this, I suppose, like Sanam said, would be for fiction or nonfiction, but just research that goes into writing a piece, that even having access to research or being able to do it, or like Sanam said, having the time to do it, all of this requires a great deal of privilege and flexibility. And access.
A lot of context.
That we don't really have in a lot of instances.
Exactly. And I remember, I think this was 7-8 years ago, maybe at a literary festival, and this historian who came to Lahore, and this was the first time that I actually, because I'd never really thought before about how history is written. So he'd written a lot of popular books on history, and he was talking about his method of research, for example, his access to the archives in Lahore. And the person who was interviewing him, he was complimenting this person, this white person, was complimenting the other guy and saying that this is the person who actually got me access to these archives. Then he turns to the audience, packed hall in Alhambra, and he goes, and you guys don't have access to that. And even, like your university students in history, and we have people who've gone to Cambridge and Oxford to do their PhDs in history afterwards, so it's not something that Pakistanis are just not doing. So people at GC or FC or Punjab University who are studying history in Pakistan, apparently, according to this person, don't have access to the archives. And this was something that I found shocking. Because, we talk a lot about, our young generation talks a lot about writing our own history. And if you don't have access to the resources, how are you going to do that? And that's something, and especially because of partition, we already don't have access to more than half the documents anyway. And I remember reading about Aisha Jalal, for example, that she was able to write stunning award-winning history books and her own thesis as well. She got the Genius Grant, the MacArthur Grant, because she could actually go and research in the archives in India as well. She's had access to both, and she's she's a professor at Tufts, and despite the Pakistani origin, and I think she's the daughter of a diplomat or something. And despite that, she had access to those resources, and I'm glad somebody did.
Yes, quite right. Because clearly, when you have access, then all sorts of amazing things can happen. We're going to take a very quick break and come back to talk a little bit more about history. Stay with us. Welcome back to this fascinating conversation. Having so much fun. So before the break, we were talking about reclaiming history. And I think that that's a really important thing to consider. And Sanam, I feel like here, I think that the book, The Woman Like Her, is so important also because it is about a woman who really shook things up and changed things up. And like Madeeha said before the break, when we talk about who is writing our history, a lot of the times, it's not us. It's somebody else who doesn't, quote unquote, belong to this culture, belong to this milieu, and yet they are sort of sitting down and telling us about us. And that's weird.
It is weird. It's a bit frustrating, isn't it? Like to have this as the norm. I mean, even when if we even just consider journalism, and anytime something terrible happens, or anytime something good even happens, where, like, when you have a foreign reporter come in and cover it and you're reading about it, like, I want to hear from people over here. I want to see those stories and their perspective. I think there sometimes is a great deal of merit because if you're an outsider and you come into a situation, sometimes you see it from a fresh perspective. You're able to offer perspective that a local can't. So I do appreciate that, and particularly people who do it really well. There was a book that was out just recently. I don't know if I should do a shout out or plug it, but
I think I know which one you mean. Yes.
Yeah. So for instance, he spent 9 years here in Pakistan, and then he goes off and he writes a book about it. And I really appreciate people who take that time and spend the time here, and they don't just parachute in, and they do tell our stories, and they help it sort of reach a wider audience. I think we need both. We need the locals and a lot of representation there. And have people coming in and telling your stories because it's interesting. Why not?
But then
it's just not equal, right?
That's the thing. It's equal because we aren't parachuting into Western culture and writing about their history per se, or per se bini at all. Like, we don't do it. There's no kind of reciprocity of that. And even like this thing that Madeeha, you said about like the archives, for example, and like Sanam said, we are a very young nation, and there are so many stories that we still have. And even if one were to write a family memoir, let's say, like people have, half of those documents one probably wouldn't even have access to because they are across the border, or they're in a museum in England somewhere, or in a library, in a university library.
Exactly.
But how do you get there?
Exactly.
Like, how do you tell your own story in your own words without the necessary tools to do that?
Exactly. And the thing is that I have friends, for example, who've gotten postgraduate degrees maybe from England. They can obviously go to the British Library. One of my friends, she got access to Munto's letters. They're in the British Library. Like, imagine. Exactly. But there should be, an archive in his house over here kept by his family. Traditionally, that's what, people do with their own history, but that's not the case with ours.
No.
So you can have access to them, but then who has the time or the money studying over here maybe to actually go to London, get the visa, explain why you want to go there for a week, stay there, research in the British Library. That's just something that's, like that access is not available to people.
Yeah, which naturally then sort of leaves that space open for people who do have access.
Of course.
And on one level, like, how do you push back then?
Of course. And, like with other countries, they do actually have grants that they give to people for doing this sort of research. I remember there was this one book, this thin book about the Beaumont, about, this specific class of people in Regency, England. And for that, she had gotten 10 different grants. She was doing a postdoc at Yale. She got the Leverhulme Scholarship, the fellowship, and like a bunch of them just to do research for that one book. That kind of that kind of patronage is just not available here. It's because, and it does depend on the government, because the government in the UK is very serious about funding arts, funding the arts, funding the humanities, especially history. They've got these prizes like the Baillie Gifford Prize, the Wolfson Prize for History, so many of them. Over here, we don't have any of those things. Like, we're not even funding science if, we wanted to point out some conflict between different subjects. That's not the case. We're just not funding education or, anything that is contributing to education or knowledge at all. Not really.
So, Sanam, do you feel like in a sort of environment like this, journalism is the closest thing we have to that kind of history writing?
I also don't want to say, okay, we don't have access to things, or we don't know enough about grants, or travel is not easy, because I also think part of the fun, as crazy as it sounds with this book for me, was, okay, if these are my limitations, how do I make it work regardless? So for instance, just like one example, I needed access, or I wanted access to Kandil Baloch's entire Twitter archive. If you pay Twitter, say $3,000 to $4,000, you're able to get access to someone's archive in that way. It just so happened that when I started research, I had no idea about this.
Exactly. I'm like, have I got $3,000?
So I started researching her at the time when Donald Trump actually came to power, and there was this man in the US who's a hacktivist. And he, for journalists, particularly freelance journalists and writers, he had somehow, I don't even want to try explaining the tech side of it, but basically he had created this sort of code thing where if you entered that in your browser, it would load up all of the tweets for you, his entire archive. And so you can use it for your research.
That's awesome.
I saw that. I found his, but I found his email. I sent him an email and I said, listen, I have no interest in Trump, but there's this woman that I'm researching. I have no money. I can't offer you anything, but can you help? I need her entire Twitter archive. He tweaked his thing a little bit, the code or whatever it is. He sent it to me, and I swear this was the only moment where I felt like I was in a movie. So I entered it in my browser, and all of her tweets, down to her very first one on Twitter, they just started loading. That stuff was also very fun, and I think that's the fun in when you're doing a nonfiction piece and you're having to be creative. And we're nothing if not jugaru. Like we come up with all sorts of things. And in this day and age, I mean, with everything online and with the kind of access you can even get over there, and people help out. Like, what's the worst that'll happen? People will say no. I mean, really, that's not that big a deal. But I also don't want to discourage people by saying, oh, well, our museums are horrible and they don't have stuff, and we're constantly imbibing culture from the West, but there's no back and forth. Like, I mean, this is the work in progress, and this is the work. Finding that stuff, like kis tarah aap nikalte ho. That's the fun of it as well.
And I think that's a limitation would have when one is trying to write a more historical piece, and sort of you need documents from the past and all of that. But a book like A Woman Like Her, this is current and this is contemporary, and these are the kind of stories that we can tell, like you said, like with a little bit of brain power and a little bit of sort of getting around the things. These are the stories that one can be telling. And what I find really exciting is that this is sort of reclaiming a female space in what seems to me like still a very male-dominated genre also. What do you think about that? Because like I feel like a nonfiction is still, men are writing it about other men.
That's absolutely true. And I was so aware of that when I started doing this. Like, who is it that's actually writing these nonfiction books about this place? And even if it's civil servants or diplomats or whatever, you are mostly seeing men put these stories out, men writing history books, or like, and I'm not even seeing young men. It's mostly older men.
Exactly.
So I didn't understand why is this the case. So forget even women, like young women. Why aren't we even seeing younger men? I'm curious about their perspective too. So it's definitely a very, very male space.
No, absolutely. And I feel like as we reach the end of the show, nonfiction is such an exciting and fresh and there's so much space there for a lot of really cool things to say. And I think that this conversation has been so much fun because it's really a lot of nonfiction is about telling a story and telling the story about how you see the world. And it's really exciting. And it's something that I hope that more, younger people begin to look at in a more serious way. Well, thank you for joining me, Madeeha.
Thank you. Thank you,
Sanam, for being with me. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't read it, A Woman Like Her is a book that you should be reading this year. If you are late to the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on The Coffee Table. Bye now.